So my name is Lawrence Gerstley. I'm going to be talking about our uses of Airflow in an on-prem research environment. My background is I'm a cognitive psychologist and an informaticist by training. I like to mention this at the beginning of talks because my background research has no applicability to what I'm talking about today, but it is in synesthesia and cross-modality. So my research was into looking at musical primitives and their visual analogs. And again, the reason I mention this is if anybody has synesthesia or knows somebody who has synesthesia, talk to me afterwards. It's always interesting. I work with Kaiser Permanente, and as you may know, we're one of the largest healthcare organizations in the States. We have over 12 million members. We are a complete integrated care model, so that's everything from insurance, hospitals, and of course, medical care. And Kaiser focuses on preventative medical care. You may have seen the Thrive Thrive campaign, which really focuses on making sure that people are taking care of their health preventatively. And if we do that, there are obviously better long-term health outcomes for our patients. The DOR, the Division of Research, was founded in 1961 as the research arm of the Northern California Kaiser region. Our founder, Morris Collins, was one of the pioneers in healthcare informatics and an early adopter in the electronic health record. So we've had our 60-year anniversary recently. The Northern California region is just one of the Kaiser regions. We are the largest of the Kaiser regions, but we also have regions in Southern California, here in Washington, Oregon, Hawaii, Colorado, Mid-Atlantic states. And because of this early adoption of the electronic health record, we have longitudinal data that allows us to do the kind of research that other organizations really are hoping to do in the future. So we've got, for some patients, we've got from birth to present time, and that can go back that 30 plus years. The division's primary keys and goals are to conduct rigorous, high-impact epidemiological, clinical, healthcare, translational medical research, and our primary work product are peer-reviewed articles. So you can think about us as being the equivalent of an educational institution. And the DOR supports our clinician researchers and our internal and external collaborators. So we'll collaborate with other educational institutions. We collaborate across multiple countries, et cetera. So we have a staff of over 68 research scientists and biostatisticians and 17 fellows, and all of their supporting staff. So we are a group of about 600 plus individuals, and we perform medical research in the medical fields that are of interest to our staff scientists. So that can be behavioral health, biostatistics, cancer, obstetrics, nephrology, radiology, etc. The IT and the data science departments within the organization provide centralized computational services to all of those scientists and their staffs. And we provide recommendations and best practices for commonly encountered computational scenarios to achieve the research aims. And we consult with our research staff to implement novel solutions when they have unique problems. So because we're a research organization, we are always trying to do cutting-edge research, and that can involve bringing in new computational packages from the outside world, trying things out iteratively to see what kind of results are obtained, et cetera. Now, to do this, I talked a little bit about our on-prem structure. We can't really use cloud services. So although there is PHI approval, we're extremely reluctant to have our patient data go into the cloud because of any kind of potential breach. That may change over time, but right now we do almost everything on-prem, and that can be everything from ML, LLM, to image analysis. To provide those on-prem services, we have a number of Kubernetes clusters and tooling and storage fabric that we call the Advanced Computational Infrastructure. And this provides that large pool of resources of CPUs, RAM, storage, and a lot of GPUs to allow our researchers to perform their work. And we've got storage on the order of petabytes now, and usually those data are retained for the duration of a study and several years afterwards. So the ACI, that Advanced Computational Infrastructure, empowers research access. So we try to democratize our computational resources while still dealing with the problems of the fact that we've got a limited number of those resources. We do things like provide long-lived containers that our researchers will use to do their analyses. So this can be our Studio, Jupyter Lab, Julia, and ad hoc containers that we may create for different projects. We utilize Airflow, and we're pretty much at the beginning of our journey with Airflow. We're only a couple of years into it, but it allows us to enable scalable deployments to provision batch workloads, and I'll be showing you a little bit about what we do with those batch workloads in Kubernetes. So here's an example of a couple of the projects that we're using and have used Airflow in recently. We're using machine learning processing of like 600,000 deliveries to predict the likelihood of hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, which is an injury that can occur during delivery. And the idea is to try to determine if an injury is going to happen before the clinician might detect it, and thus result in better outcomes for that delivery. We're currently using LLMs to do structured data extraction from unstructured radiological notes. So we are trying to determine maximal vessel diameter from radiological notes, and then use that structured data in our aneurysm registry. We're doing large-scale tissue segmentation, so that is taking CTs and trying to determine the amount of adipose tissue that then can be used as features in statistical analyses. And finally, we're using NLP techniques to try to determine the likelihood of early onset psychosis from patients from their progress notes. In all of these, we've leveraged Airflow to help us process these very large data sets. So some of the ways that we use Airflow in DOR, there's the standard ones that I won't bore you with too much here, where we're doing ETL to bring data out of our data warehouses and transform them into data lakes that are then used for analyses. But more importantly, we use it for iterative ad hoc experimentation. And so the idea is that we have an analyst or a researcher who wants to devise an experimental run with different statistical techniques and need to run that repeatedly. And to do that, we usually will deploy a container out of Airflow in Kubernetes to run whatever particular computational stack they need to achieve their aim. And to do that, we have templated DAGs and generalized DAGs that allow you to inject in your script, your data sources, and to ask for the amount of resources that you need to achieve that task. So because we're on-prem, we have limited resources. Ideally, we would want to have every researcher be able to spin up their own implementation of Airflow, especially because they would then have access to those secure resources they need within Airflow, the variables, the database connections, the Kubernetes cluster information, et cetera. I'll talk a little bit about at the end about how we get around that right now, because as we're limited and we need those cores to do the actual statistical analyses, we have to have everybody coexist in a small number of airflow containers, and that necessitates having hundreds of users in the same container. So we use Airflow for research pilot work oftentimes. And so these pilots are repeated processes that might be needed for the duration of a study. A study can go anywhere from a couple of months to many years. So you may need to repeatedly run an analysis on a daily cohort. We use it for an emergent process that I'll talk about in a moment. And then sometimes if we have achieved a promising aim, we might use Airflow to run a clinical pilot until such a time as the model or whatever process we're trying to run can be moved over into wider Kaiser and turned into a real production process by our IT team. So here's a use case that we probably all want to forget about. During the pandemic, it became obvious that we needed to know where we were going to have a surge of cases. So if we wanted to have enough staff and enough supplies to handle that surge in COVID cases, it would help if we could have some predictive insight into that. And to that end, we created a surge model very rapidly and implemented a daily DAG that then would take daily patient data, do those predictions, and publish that data to an operational dashboard. So that's more or less a traditional DAG model. But we also use it for our data preparation. So one of the things we may need to do when we get a new project, let's talk here about CT analysis, is that we may get a request to pull a huge number of CTs for a cohort. And we have started to utilize Airflow as the backbone of doing those kind of ad hoc requests. So we communicate with a clinical medical image archive, pull out a finite set of those CTs, and then persist them to our data fabric. I've been learning a lot in this week about 3.0 and the possibility of having an edge executor. But right now we do this with layering on our processes on a clinical, what's called a PACS, or picture archive. We also use it to run text and image de-identification at scale. So we may have many terabytes of unstructured text, or some of those images that I was referring to, CTs, MRIs, mammograms, and then we use Airflow ad hoc to do that de-identification. As I was mentioning earlier, we do generalized parameterized scripts. And the idea is that we want to be able to utilize Airflow to allow our analysts to deploy their workloads in Kubernetes, because it's a little too hard to try to train people into how to do ad hoc Kubernetes deployment. So we've endeavored to make a generic DAG that would allow people to take their scripts and to do the deployment and handle all of the Kubernetes plumbing for them. Now, the challenge is that analysts have to develop their scripts according to Kubernetes patterns that'll make them easy to deploy. Why is that a challenge? Well, every PI and their staff has their own way of doing things. Because they're responsible for bringing in their own money, their own grants, they're very much used to doing things the way that they want to do it. However, when they go to execute at scale, we oftentimes have to end up in a refactoring process before those scripts can be deployed. So we're trying to educate folks into good programming practices, which are probably well known to all of you, But those programming practices make it much easier to deploy those workloads later. And so crucially, we need to make sure that everybody's scripts allow for their hyperparameter and their parameters to be injected via a single JSON string, and to utilize relative paths for data access within their scripts, to inject their base paths via parameters for command line execution. And this one seems very obvious, but we have a lot of trouble with it, to make sure that they're properly using external secrets management. This is an example of that genericized DAG that I was talking about, and you can see here, you can specify the location of the script and the specific Docker image that you may want to run. And then, of course, the key magic there is that JSON formatted string that allows them to do really whatever they want, so that they can run many different iterations of this DAG with different parameters at runtime. And then finally, we collect the desired number of CPUs, GPUs, RAM that they want to run that particular experiment. You may see some functional overlap here with MLflow and Kubeflow, but really we're trying to use Airflow because I think it's a lot easier to write the DAGs there, and it's a much lower lift to try to do education of people to do this kind of execution. It also sets us up nicely to use that same genericized DAG to be deployed via a RESTful call, and this allows people to then use that pattern if they want to put a different kind of front end on it, or another testing harness with their different use cases around it. So we have a heavy reliance on Kubernetes pod operators. I remember I once read an article about Airflow saying all of your operators should be Kubernetes operators, which is, I think, a little zealous, but I kind of like it. So we deploy our large analytical workloads right now through Airflow exclusively, unless those workloads are being deployed by the data science team. We use two methods within our DAGs of doing that deployment. If any of you have done Kubernetes pod operators, you're probably familiar with these trade-offs. We do Pythonic v1 type resources, and we do document-based resources where those documents will coexist with the DAGs in the GitLab repository. So this is an example here of that K8's document-based deployment style. And then finally, we use Airflow for large-scale analyses, and I think this is quite interesting. We'll use the Airflow process to deploy large-scale clusters, ephemeral clusters that run in Kubernetes that the scripts can then attach to. So we use it to deploy Spark clusters and H2O clusters, and then we have the scripts attached to those clusters for the duration of the run, and then spin down those clusters at the end. To that end, we've written a cluster sensor that can then determine whether that cluster has come up, is it healthy, and available for use. Now, the last thing I want to go over, and this is to spark conversation with anyone afterwards if they're facing the same problem, is what are we contending with our access problems? Because we don't have very clear multi-tenancy within a single Airflow deployment, we have the risk of having people access secrets and connections that they shouldn't have access to. There is fine-grained control over access, obviously, in the UI, but we haven't had a lot of success with that so far. So what we've done is we're having users do the authoring of their DAGs in the GitLab environment, and we git sync to our Kubernetes deployment. And then when a user wants to merge their request, they issue a merge request, and we have a custom CI/CD Python linter, and validator go through their DAG and try to determine if they're using any sensitive resources. If they are, we make sure that they have prefixed that resource by their user ID. And of course, we can determine their user ID from their session. And in that way, it's a bit of a kludge, but it makes sure that you've only authored to those connections that you have created yourself. And thus, we're able to, in a CD script, make sure that it passes that validation test before it can be merged into the mono repo. Some of our future plans, we're starting to implement Airflow 3. We're trying to upgrade our deployment right now. Very promising work with the AI API that we'll be using for LLM inferencing. We're going to take that vessel diameter study that I mentioned before, and that is going to pilot right now. So on a daily basis, we're going to be trying to determine patients who may have early signs of abdominal and iliac aortic aneurysms by utilizing that. We're working to get wider adoption of Airflow, again, because we have an opt-in style right now. Nobody has to use this if they don't want to. So we just need to make it so attractive and so easy to use that people will. And ideally, we want to leverage LLM and Taskflow for easier DAG authoring. We have to run our LLMs on-prem, which we're doing now in OpenWebUI and Olama. So there are some concerns as to, or do we have enough capacity there if we get enough adoption of our DAGs?